Hello, welcome back to part 3 of our lecture on Emily Dickinson. This should be the last video of the series, and we're going to look at the last assigned poem, which is also one of her most well-known, poem 712, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. So I'm pretty sure you're probably not going to be able to see this image real clearly. I got it as clear and I got as much of the poem as I could capture here, but I don't think that image is going to be terribly clear. But you should have your books, okay? So if you will look on page 650 and follow along there, we're going to look at this poem together. Now, before I dive in too deep into this poem, there is an extended metaphor here. So we talked briefly about, in the previous video, Emily Dickinson's use of simile, where she's using comparisons that use like or as. Again, if you recall from lessons that you might have had in middle school, because this is really where that goes back to, right? But a metaphor is a comparison that does not use like or as. And in this one, the metaphor as it is simply this idea of personifying death as a stagecoach driver, if you will. In modern terms, we might think of her comparing death to a taxi cab driver or an Uber driver. That might be an even better way to think about it. All right, so death as our Uber driver. Let's keep that in mind as we read this poem. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet, my tulle. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So that whole carriage ride is the metaphor of this poem. Because what's happening on a literal level here? She's describing the process of death. It's like the horseman comes to get you. You have died. You are passing over to the other side. And again, using that metaphor of it being like a carriage ride. Here's our image. Let me see if I can move to the next slide here. And I love this image here. There were a lot of images of this poem I could have picked, but this one, I love this one. And it just seemed like it so captured the essence of her poem. I mean, there is Emily Dickinson herself in her gossamer gown, as she says, and she is in the back of this carriage as they make this journey towards her eternal life. That's where she's picturing herself going here. All right, let's dive back into the poem. So again, the big thing we're stressing here is, where do we see elements of romanticism versus realism? And usually in her poems, one or the other is going to kind of have the upper hand here. So you might see both, but it might lean more heavily towards one or the other. First of all, we do have the personification, and that very much casts the poem in the romantic tradition. We've got personification with the I speaker. She is the person in the carriage. She is the person on this journey. We've got the personification of death, because death is an abstract concept. But here, death is portrayed as a human figure. Death is a coachman. Death is capable of driving. As I said before, death is our Uber driver here. Is there mention of nature? Yes. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. So there is recognition of the natural world. There is some awe and reverence for nature here, very much in that romantic tradition. But it does have, because it's a poem about death, it has that Gothic element to it as well that we often associate with romanticism. And everything feels eerie, kind of, in this poem, right? I mean, you think about the imagery here. The night, this great journey, this carriage journey is taking place at night past the setting sun. She's in her gossamer gown, she says. Now that's a direct reference to burial clothes, probably what she would have died in on her deathbed. She would have been in that gossamer gown. But also, it was very customary back then that this would have been her burial attire as well. So we get those very eerie kind of Gothic images, right? Very witch-like in a way, almost. This line I always found interesting. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So I think here it's that idea of, once we die, life still goes on, right? Earthly life still goes on. Children are still going to be playing at recess. And it feels strange to think that there's an existence that carries on even after we're gone. So here she's kind of commenting on that. The children are playing a game, probably something like Ring Around the Rosie. She references the ring at recess. And then those fields of gazing grain, the setting sun. Again, those images are serving a purpose. It's the idea of passing through something that's still alive, right? But she herself is dead and seems to have an awareness of that. Imagery. Now this is where the realism comes in, but I would say take the realism with a grain of salt, because this is more spiritual in nature. But she does focus on that single image of the house that they come to. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Possibly a reference to the heavenly mansion where she's going to spend eternity. I would say overall this poem is, it has some elements of realism, but it is leaning more heavily towards that romantic tradition. I mean, everything from the images that it evokes, the feeling, the spirituality, it does feel much more embedded in romanticism, I think, than realism. Realism would be something more like the previous poem of hers that we looked at, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. Because that's focusing on the mundane. It's not focusing on the spiritual element of death. It's focusing on something very trivial. And it is focusing on that idea of the single image, which is the fly. The whole poem in that instance becomes focused on the fly. This one is very different in its approach, its theme, its feeling. And this one is looking at death from a more spiritual perspective. So I would argue, yes, this poem is definitely more steeped in romanticism, but perhaps with some element of realism there. But I think we get the realism much stronger in I Heard a Fly Buzz Before I Died. And even the first poem that we looked at, There's a Certain Slant of Light, we get more elements of realism, I think, there. But that one also is leaning more heavily towards romanticism. Okay, so that is going to do it for our lecture video. You will have a short assessment at the end of this module for you to complete. And I will see you all in class. And next week, same time, same place, we'll be back here for another module. Bye-bye.